Well, it's still Inauguration Day and we are live on Plus TV Africa. Let's move our attention to education. We know that education offers children a ladder out of poverty and a path to a promising future. But how well has this education sector fared in Nigeria? Now, joining us in the studio, I have with me Abolaji Osime. She's the CEO Global College. It's good to have you join us.
Thank you.
Always good to see you. And of course, I never get to see you without seeing more Adefeso. Olateju, she's the MD TEP Centre. It's good to have you beautiful ladies here. So it's Inauguration Day, and we all know that we're here to set an agenda for the new administration, both at the federal and the state level. Now, I understand a little bit told me that you were at the inauguration today.
Yeah.
So you obviously, felt the atmosphere. Let's talk about education in Nigeria. I think we've done this before, but we hear that we have at least 11 plus million out of school children. And out of that percentage, at least 70 are females. Now, well, you know the saying that if you train a woman, you train a community, But I don't know, if we have that, as I say, how come we have so many out of school girl children, talk less of all the children?
I think more of the out of school kids, children are in the north. And then if you understand also what has happened with insurgency and all of that, and then also the culture and the religion in the past didn't favor educating the girls. So, but basically I think what's happening now is that things are changing. We had a seminar yesterday that Professor Tuli was saying that, look, most of the out of school are actually not out of school. They're actually in low-income private schools. So they might not be in public schools, but in the north, we know for sure that at least, I would say about a good 80% are actually, some of them are out of school. There are a lot of stuff during the insurgency period, because of the IDP camps and everything, the schools were ravaged and all of that. So they lost a lot of years. So the important thing now is, I think, the focus of the government and this particular, at least this administration coming in, is to ensure that we make sure there's a lot of focus on the Northeast right now, but it's important for the government to get children back into school. To start educating them. Some of them have lost years. Some of them are older, or they're like 17 or 18, that they might not be able to get in school, but you can do things like vocational and different options for them to go into school. But the ones that can go back into school, we need to get them back into school. And there's a lot of attention because it's so important that we educate our women. So important. Because, I mean, I have a school, and I can tell you for free that the girls do better than the boys because they're more focused. Boys are generally distracted. Later they catch up.
I can tell the men are saying this is such a
no. They
now.
actually catch up later. But when you start off, the girls are the ones they do much better. But the boys catch up later. So we definitely have to give equal opportunity. There's a need for equity in Nigeria. We have to give equal opportunity to the girls and to the boys. I mean, the boys already have the opportunity, but the girls need to. We need engineers. We need doctors from the girls. So attention has to be paid, I think, in the north and some parts of Nigeria as well, like the boy child in the east. A lot of them don't drop out. There's quite a lot of dropouts and all of that. People are thinking, I'm in secondary school. At the end of it, will I get into university? Do I go out and just get a job? Exactly. So we need to look at that critically and say, what are we going to do for this generation so we don't keep losing generations?
Mo, to you, there are a lot of practices, cultural and traditional practices that also, one way or the other affect the number of children that we allow to go to school. For example, she just said something about other parts of Nigeria. Now, there are certain parts of Nigeria where, in fact, if not the whole of Nigeria, where they say, oh, it pays to send the boy child to school because, he will come out and then, send the others to school. But sending a girl child to school, someday some man will come and marry her. And we always attribute that most of the time to the north, but surprisingly it's happening in the southern parts of the country in the glare of everyone. And then because we have stereotyped the north because of the religious or the traditional practices, we fail to see what's happening behind, just around us. So is there any form of orientation that is going on every other day, and not just on TV and radio, but going out there to the marketplaces, to communities, to say it is important to send both male and female to school? It is, and for those who don't send their male children to school because they don't have money, they send them to learn a trade. You can still send them to school and they can still learn that trade because we have, what do they call them? This how they call those schools. The secondary schools where they learn a trade. Technical colleges and vocational schools. So how big is the awareness programs out there for those who are still practicing these things?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think that there are so many different pockets of good practice happening across the country, and sometimes I feel that part of the scale of the challenge is in that we don't document enough what's going on. I can give one example that I'm familiar with. And this was a project that we supported a few years ago, and they were trying to change the mindset of people in a particular location about the benefits of sending a girl to school. And they used one of the most creative ways by which you can do that. They used theater and film. So they used theater and film, and they took the production around many different villages, so rural areas. And what they were trying to do was to highlight the economic advantage of sending a girl child to school. And so they showed how it is that a girl can really economically enrich her family if you give her the opportunity to get good quality education. So that's one example, and there are a lot of things that are happening across the country. In the east of the country, it's a bit of a reverse situation where we see a lot of boys feeling the need to drop out of school or not enroll at all because of the economic realities. And so in those contexts, we're looking at programs that then help to change that orientation, that the fact that these boys are not in school is not just because they've chosen not to be in school. There's a socio-economic undertone to this, because the wealthier families will ensure that their boys go to school. But it's the poorer families that cannot ensure that their boys go to school. And so a lot of programming is required there as well. So there is quite a bit going on. And I think that we do need to do a better job of documenting these practices.
Talking about documenting, we don't have truly a maintenance culture. So we don't tell our stories. We wait for outsiders to come and tell our stories. For example, we get numbers or percentages or research and results come to us, or it's published, and then we say, no, that's not true. Where did you get that information from? So maybe if we do that first, we probably would not be able, we would not be having that issue of disparity in the figures. But let's move on to low-cost private education, which is like a focal point these days. When we hear private, the first thing that comes to your mind is expensive. But then you hear low-cost private, which is 2-3 words that are not supposed to be together. Explain to those who are watching what exactly that is. Actually,
in Lagos State, the different cadres of private schools, actually. And Lagos State has 1,600 public schools and has about 1.1 million students, roughly about 1.1 million. And then the private sector has about 18,000, between 16,000 and 18,000 private schools. So education is being provided in Lagos State particularly, and in some other states as well, by the private, and Lagos has its own constraints. So when you now look at, there's the very elite, the APEN schools that you call the APEN schools, the top-notch, the British schools, the American schools, where you go, very high quality schools that match what you, a lot of people send their kids abroad, but now they're keeping them back, which means you're keeping the money back in Nigeria, which is a good thing. So we need those schools. And then you have some expatriates who come, who want their kids to go to familiar surroundings, so we need those schools. So we have that. Then we have the middle income as well. So you see some of the middle income in like Yaba, in some areas, which is not too expensive, but it's still slightly. But the challenge is for the low income. This is the poorest of the poor, who are supposed to go to public schools. So a lot of them go to public schools, and there's a lot of complaint that the public schools are not providing the quality of education, and then maybe infrastructure and all of that. So that's now drove this market that has come up, which is now called the low-income schools. So a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of people, retired teachers, came out and said, look, let us provide education for the poor, because if we don't provide education for the poor of, the poorest, and they're sitting at home and they cannot go to public schools and they're walking with their feet, then we're going to have a problem on our hands. So a lot of these people came, like the AFED Association has quite a few of the low-income schools in the association. So they just came together and said, look, in my community, kids are on the streets. We would have had a lot more out of school if we didn't have, because I think over nearly 2 million now are in private schools, in Lagos State. So that's how they came up. And, yesterday when we were talking, and Professor Tuli was talking about India. India has a massive population. So India has had this particular market growing, and it's important because we must educate Nigerian children. Whether it's the private schools providing the education, I have a private school, and I'm funded by I'm self-funded. Even the banks, the interest rate is too high. But I know that I have to provide to that cadre of students, because we have to provide different people are looking for different things, and then they cannot afford certain things. But what our own focus, and this majority of us, is that we must educate the Lagosian. And then we have a lot of people coming from the north now. Yesterday I was saying to my driver, I said, this is an Aboki camp. A lot of people are living, in fact, it was said that there was a GSS3 that left one of the northern states, the whole GSS3, and came into Lagos State. So we have that. Sorry, a whole class of GSS3 moved into Lagos State. They moved into Lagos State schools, yeah. So, wow. Yeah, because, the insurgency and everything is driving people. So we're having an inflow
of more students.
Yeah, because education is still, there are a lot of low-income schools that will take them on, and it's safe to, at least relatively safe to go to school here. So that's why that has come up, and I think it's an important development. It's just for government to now see how they're going to partner with them.
I hear that these low-cost private educational schools actually saved Lagos State government about ₦1 trillion. That's a fairly good amount of money for government to save. But now you're talking about partnering. How do you think that these schools can be properly regulated so that the standard of education is not dropped because of where they're coming from, or because of the inability to fund, the school better compared to the middle income or the high income, schools? So how best can it be regulated, and how can government come in to partner? Yes, it's saving them this amount of money, but how best can it work?
So on the one hand, I think that there are tremendous cost savings to the government simply by the presence of these schools. I don't think that's anything for the government to pat itself on the back about, because the reality is that these schools have come about as a result of failings in the government system. But that said, I remember conducting some research a few years ago and going into some of the poorest schools, that you will find within the low-cost private sector. Some of these schools charge 1,000 to 3,000 naira a term as school fees.
Wow.
And terrible conditions, not the sort of conditions that you want your children to study under. And I remember asking, some of the parents, that why do you continue to use this school? And the dominant characteristic, or the dominant factor that they all responded with was, I feel the school and its teachers really cares about my child. I feel like they really do care about my child. And so when you think about population sizes in the public schools, population size is much smaller in the private school, you realize that some of the characteristics that parents desire the most when they use these schools, particularly at the lower levels, so early childhood all the way to junior primary, they're very difficult to replicate in the public sector. It's really difficult for a teacher who's teaching a class of 60 children to pick up the phone and call 15 of them if they don't come to school today, to say, why didn't you come to school today? Or to visit 18 of them who didn't show up to school today. It's much easier to do. So I guess for the first time, I really began to empathize, with the government, because some of these characteristics are difficult to replicate in the public sector. So it's not to take away the responsibility from the government, but it's to say that there's a place for provision, both in the public and the private sector. And that's where your question is now very pertinent. So where does the partnership come into it? From my own research, I would say that Lagos State in particular probably deserves some commendation for the way that they have open their arms to the myriad associations of private schools. There are so many associations. Even associations that predominantly have schools that are not registered, or the schools that we refer to as non-approved schools. And they regularly have meetings, with them. They have stopped the indiscriminate clamping down, of schools. And they have instituted a mechanism which was piloted via a DFID-funded program called Deepen, and which ended a couple of years ago. They've instituted a mechanism called GAPS. And GAPS is a grading system where schools are given the opportunity to self-assess, identify what they need to do in order to move up the ladder of standards, and by so doing, improve the quality of their service offering. And what this does is it then gives an opportunity for schools to then have an opportunity to be registered formally, the opportunity to access financing if they couldn't access financing before, opportunity to hold their heads up high and say that I am also a registered.
So what you're saying is that instead of chastising them, they bring them in and say, hey, let's see how we can get you better so you can be on the same level with schools that have been approved, which is great.
That's what we're seeing.
Because in River State, I remember, I think 2 years ago, the Commissioner for Education, I don't know if he's still the Commissioner, Gugu Jaja at the time, decided to clamp down on every school that was unapproved. In fact, they were being shut down. They were taken to court. All sorts of things were happening. And then they came up with interesting ways to dissuade more people to come into that sector. So, and now with the picture you painted, maybe there are better ways to go about it, just like the Lagos State government is doing.
There certainly are better ways to go about it.
But how do you weed out the bad seeds? Because we do have people who shouldn't be running schools in the name of making money and not necessarily impacting in the lives of these children.
And that's where you can't take away the role of the government when it comes to quality assurance. Government quality assures both public and private schools, or at least it's supposed to. And I don't really think that another organization can take on that responsibility fully, because regulation and standards, when we think about basic education as a fundamental human right, the government upholds our rights. That's what it's supposed to be according to the Constitution. And so the government should be upholding the rights of these children to have access to a safe, secure, comfortable, learning environment. So definitely there are ways to go about it, and I think that a state like Lagos probably offers some learnings. A lot of these learnings are documented, and I think that other states can learn from some of the
pick up from it. I'm going to come back to you, Abolaji. Let's talk about public schools. I'm a product of public schools. Well, I went to a missionary school that was taken over by the government at some point, and then they discovered that they were making a mess of it, so they gave it back to the Catholics. But I had great education, Although, I remember in my first year in secondary school, I was in just 1N. That's to tell you how many we were.
Wow.
Because at the time, people preferred to send their children to public schools than to private schools. In fact, if you said you went to a private school, we looked at you like you didn't pass your common entrance, huh? But it was the standard of education then was way better than what we have today. So can we ever have public schools go back to where it was, the glory days? Is it ever going to be possible with the way that government is trying to stretch itself too thin, trying to do everything?
I went to a public school, and I think, it was a very good public school, Queen's School in Ibadan. And that was the foundation that was laid. When I look at the public sector, there are a lot of constraints. Like I just said to you, the infrastructure in Lagos is really, I wouldn't say it's under siege, but Lagos is built for a certain number of population. Now it's 22 million. And majority of them are young people. In that category, we're talking about maybe 60% are young people. So Lagos State doesn't have the infrastructure to build the schools, And when you look at schools now, the most important part of a school, or the most important aspects, is the teachers. Unfortunately, the colleges of education. So you go to the root of the problem to try and solve the problem. One of the biggest things is the colleges of education have such a low entry barrier, such that you're getting people who don't want to go to other courses, or who have failed going to teach your children. And you're saying, okay, you can come in with 3 credits for WAEC. And then they're now telling us that, okay, we had 40% pass rate in WAEC, but the guys that were teaching you didn't pass either. So you are feeding in the wrong people to feed. So the colleges of education themselves, there's absolutely a need for a change. If we want to fix our public schools, it's possible. But we need to go to the root, and it takes political will. You know, political will means that I am determined to ensure that the public schools provide the education to the poorest of the poor. There's still some people, some students, some young people that cannot even go into low-income schools. I know for a fact the Tafaji incident that happened, the students who were there, who were evacuated, are still looking for schools. And the school they found, by the time they calculated, was about 100,000. It's going to cost them with uniform, with this, with that, with that.
Per child.
Per child, yeah. It's going to cost 100,000 per year. So they haven't found a missionary school wants to take them up in Tafaji, but they don't have the money. So the government just has to fix the schools, you know, because there's a certain group of people that have to go into it. But like I said, the colleges of education need to be revamped. In Finland, you cannot go and teach in Finland unless you have a master's degree. I mean, we are taking 3 credits. And they are saying masters. So guess what? Finland has the best education in the world. And then we have such indices that is scary. But it's so easy. So you guys, why don't you look at the colleges of education? Maybe you need to put them under universities and let them be degree awarding. Because of course the teacher is saying, I don't want to be a teacher because it is NCE. It's not attractive. Why don't you do something about making the profession attractive? Let them know that when they come into the profession, they're going to be paid a good salary that competes with wherever industry they want to go into.
But there are people who study education in the university. I used to have a friend who studied education, and I'm sorry, but I used to make fun of her. You study education?
That's the issue now. You're one of those.
I didn't know better.
Oh,
you know, because you know at the time you said you want to do theatre arts. You didn't. You're not
There's something wrong
you know?
somewhere.
But now we know better. So there are people who studied education, teaching, and some interesting courses in the university who have I don't know. They give them Bachelor of Arts or something, or BE, something, B.Ed, yes. So why are those people, why are we not having universities churn out more of those people to be in classrooms instead of being lecturers? Because I'm thinking, yeah, being a lecturer, you probably have to do more than that. But since these people actually, this is their forte, why are we not having them more in secondary schools, in the classrooms, because they know better?
The B.Ed goes to secondary school. I mean, I think you need a PhD to lecture.
But how many of them? We have more of the NCEs.
No. NCE is primary school.
Primary school.
NCE, the entry.
No, so I'm even saying so can't you have a B.Ed and do primary school because because the level of education there is screaming for help. Can we have regulated in a way that there's a balance of sorts?
And early education, just to say, early education is the most important aspect of a child. That is where you actually, because that's the time the brain is being formed, and that's the time they actually absorb a lot. So you need to get your best teachers in early education and primary. You need to get the best teachers.
I mean, one of my best teachers in primary school was, I think she was just finishing her NYSC and she studied English. She was a great teacher. So, I mean, why can't we do that? You want to say something?
I mean, I'm one of those that you were discriminating against.
I love you. I didn't know any better. Now I know.
A lot of people, used to ask me what I was doing in the Faculty of Education in University of Lagos. But I'm glad that I studied education. And,
thank God.
But I will say that there was a lot of discrimination even then, and even if you look at the cutoff marks now, you'd find that education courses are still the lowest, even at tertiary level.
Wow.
So it is definitely still an issue.
Wow, and this is some of the things we need to address, because if your mind is not renewed in that direction, you would always see it as that. And we see a lot more people trying to go to other professional courses, not thinking of this as a profession. So there's a lot of things.
There's also a lot of literature, on the characteristics of good teachers. And whilst I don't undermine, pre-service training is critical to prepare you, for the reality of teaching young people and children. But there's a lot of research now that shows that some of the characteristics of teachers that are most closely aligned with learning outcomes are not the ones that are easy to measure. So a lot of times, especially within contexts like ours, where we're not deliberately pushing the best into the education sector, we find that people who have characteristics such as empathy, people who naturally love children, who naturally love to teach, are generally great teachers. And if you can find those people and then layer on certification and qualification and, you know, training on how to deliver, you know, teaching, you would have an amazing product. So there are some characteristics, definitely, that you need to, and that's probably the characteristic that some of the characteristics that your NYSC teacher had.
Yes, I can never forget her. I used to suck my thumb in class, and she helped me out. I can't believe I said that on TV. Well, thank you very much. I want to thank you very much, ladies. Abolaji Osime, CEO, Global College, and Mo Adefeso, Olateju, MD, TEP Centre. Thank you, ladies. Always very impressive to have you in the studio. And maybe I might just turn to education someday when I retire.
That'd be great.
Why not?
We'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk more on education. Stay with us.